We are partway through a mini-series, jokingly but also entirely accurately titled The Year We Went to Italy 4 Times by Accident. If you're still curious how we can claim that these 4 times venturing into Italy were somewhat unintentional, well, the Palermo visit was quite last minute just because the flights were so inexpensive. The Garda trip, as we mentioned last time, had been postponed from the previous year due to global pandemics outside of our control. The third trip, that one was part of the original plan, but more on that in a second. This week's, well, it was a bit of a risk trying to tie the different parts of the trip together. Several borders to cross, transport links to figure out, etc. I vacillated back and forth for months on whether I was going to do this or just play it a bit safer. You'll see in due course, but so glad I went for it. But yes, this was the 4th occasion, and I hope this doesn't disappoint people too much. We're actually going to pass over the 3rd of these visits. It was our first trip to Venice, and as such, there's a lot I was hoping to save for our Venice episode when we finally cap off the Venetian Republic series. There was quite a bit funny about the trip actually. Not funny at the time, as there were major issues with both our outbound and return flights, but this did mean we netted a neat £440 sterling per person due to the cancelled and delayed flights, meaning we quite inexplicably managed to actually earn money from taking a brief 72-hour trip to Italy. We sort of had to earn it by sitting for hours in airport terminals, mind, but yeah, quite a result that. Anyway, yeah, I don't really want to break the seal on all our Venice footage yet, so if you'll permit us to jump forward a couple of months, it was the end of August, and just by the way things worked out, I was heading to Pula in Croatia, and that episode is already up. That was an incredibly special trip. And hey, look, I'm just going to put the call to action here. We've got a Balkans playlist which takes you all the way from Pula and Istria through the entire Croatian Adriatic, and also with episodes in Bosnia, Montenegro and Albania, all the way down to Thessaloniki. But also along that stretch, our series on the Venetian Republic takes you through the incredible history of pretty much that whole region I just mentioned, about which English speakers just tend to have no idea. So look, there's playlists. Do actually go and watch the Pula episode after you're done with this, but there's a lot more for you to catch on the channel. If you could do us a solid and leave some likes and comments on your way past, that would be a massive help, and thank you. Anyway, in the middle of the Pula episode, I left a conspicuous gap in the narrative where we actually took about 48 hours out of Croatia. You see, Pula is here on the Istrian Peninsula and not too far to the north. You first pass through a little bit of Slovenia, more on that in a moment, but then you get into the northeastern extremity of Italy and the city of Trieste. Now, you could be forgiven for not knowing anything about here. Maybe some people remember it from getting name dropped in Churchill's Iron Curtain speech.
Trieste in the Adriatic.
Other than that, I only knew that there was an Italian town called Trieste here, and it was somewhere that, despite its close proximity, had never been absorbed into the Venetian Republic. Otherwise, yeah, you never really hear this city mentioned in conversation, and you can be excused if you have no clue about it. But before we get there, so a little side quest first, and somewhere I was itching to get to. This was our first foray into Slovenia, and you know, things like this happen all the time. I'll be putting together an itinerary, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that would be so cool. No, wait, actually, it'll be too difficult to fit in. Okay, cut it. No, wait, put it back in. No, cut it. No, just rinse and repeat that for months and even years at a time. But since the Venetian episodes are out, you can get a glimpse of why specifically I was so excited to get to Copper. Well, I'd have to contain my excitement a little bit because the Flix bus was over 90 minutes late, which was, yeah, a bit of a trial. And after we did get going, it still took about 4 hours to cover around 100 kilometres. You know, a lot of that came down to traffic jams at the border, but finally got to Copper. While there are a few historic towns along this stretch of the Slovenian coast, Copper is by far the most significant. I took a loose lap to catch the highlights, climbing the Campanile, past the Praetorian Palace, round to the museum, that had some good stuff in it. So then down to the water, stopped for a drink, and also to separate my currencies. Yeah, this was back a few months before Croatia adopted the euro, so still had to try and separate out my kuna. Walked around the southern edge along what would have been the line of the walls. As you can tell, I'm abridging this rather heavily, as this is something of a sidebar to our main story, and you can watch the Venetian episodes for more of the history. I'm sure that's popping up in the top right, but it was great having a few hours exploring Copper with all its incredible Venetian architecture. Yeah, so happy I got to tick that off. Anyway, bus out of Copper. It was quite a spectacular carpet of lights on our way into Trieste. And this ended up being a night at the hostel where I had a great time just striking up conversation with strangers over a couple of drinks. It's not the sort of evening that generates any footage, but it was actually really special, like a real highlight. I actually remember it very vividly. Well, despite being very up for sleeping and the hostel surroundings being comparatively peaceful, I just couldn't drop off till at least 1 a.m, and by 5 a.m. I was awake again. But I had a train to catch at 6:50, so eventually got moving, anticipating I'd pay for this lack of sleep later in the day. I nearly got kicked off the train for not having a mask on me, which, I know this reference seems out of date, but by August 2022, even then, this was already starting to seem like an artifact of yesteryear, pretty much everywhere you went in Europe, so that one caught me off guard. But we were on our way. Then, randomly, the train had a bit of a breakdown. It just came to a halt a couple of stops short of where I needed to be. So, small change of plan. I ended up getting on a bus. We need to unpack the bus situation a bit more later, but for now, we need to talk about the first target. This is Parma Nova. Not widely known about, not what people first think of when they picture northern Italy. If you've been around the channel at all and I flash up these, do I need to say it? Who else but the Venetians? But this is no ordinary fort. Oh boy, no. This is a whole town that's a star fort and also sort of a model city social experiment built from scratch. It's actually one of the Venetians' more outlandish projects. It's one thing buttressing a town that already had some medieval walls and, just putting in a few outworks, but this is berserk. I had a great morning circling the walls and the surrounding moat in the glorious sunshine. And can't have been more than about 3 to 4 people I saw the entire time, and this was about 8:30 in the morning. A hot air balloon would not have gone amiss, but can't have it all. And now I've got to do the thing where I apologise profusely, but the more in-depth details on this topic is for the next block of Venetian episodes. So after a lap of the perimeter, quick espresso in the square, it was market day, so pretty bustling in the town. I would have preferred if the considerable number of stalls, selling mostly tat, would just get out of the way so I could get some more panoramas of the square, but you know what, that's the dirtbag tourist in me talking. Everyone seemed to be having a great morning in a historic town that still exists to serve its residents first, visitors second, and for historic towns that's increasingly rare, so yeah, good on them. Okay, more to do, so onto another bus. Now, the exact ins and outs of what happened with the buses this day is too fiddly to explain in full, but your options for tickets meant either looking for a machine that most stops just simply didn't have, and those that did, just utterly impenetrable, like didn't even show you a place name till you were a couple of steps in, or because you bafflingly couldn't just purchase a ticket from the driver or even a machine on board, you had to download an app and try and figure that out. The salient detail being the app was entirely in Italian, and I had no means on my phone of translating it, so it kind of came down to some educated guesswork and more than one ticket purchased only to discover it was not the correct type. You also have to validate it when you get on board. It is as unintuitive for a first-time user as it could possibly be. Now, I'm not meaning to encourage anyone, but entirely without meaning to, I functionally ended up jumping the bus a couple of times, despite my sincere efforts at ticket purchasing and navigating an Italian language app, so it does seem entirely plausible that if anyone was feeling non-compliant, you could pretty much just hop on and off these without getting challenged a lot of the time. Okay, but flipping back to Parma Nova at the moment, managed to pull off an absolute classic. With a little uncertainty which bus stop I should use, I wanted to ensure I didn't miss the bus. There weren't a huge quantity of them in the day. I at least managed to get on the right bus and relaxed. As we pulled out of Parma Nova to the east, then east a bit more and then north a bit, but it's fine. It's quite a circuitous route, so I'm sure it's going to double back to the south in just... nope, we are still heading north on the map. Yep, a great case of right bus, wrong direction. I very much decided to use this as a life gives you lemons scenario, and I'm very glad I did because it actually helped me with the indecision I'd had all morning about one of the locations. Instead of ending up where I was aiming, this is Udine. It's a pretty beautiful medieval city. I hadn't researched it much before the trip. It was something of a last-minute discovery that I didn't actually expect to have time for. However, allowing for buses, I gave myself 60 minutes on the clock to see it, and it did not disappoint. In the square, there's a beautiful Venetian loggia. Didn't have time to venture into the castle, appears to have a lot more modern work than the other Venetian and earlier layers of the town. It was a brief one, but very glad I got here. This time, made sure to get the bus heading south, and there was even a counter where you could purchase a physical ticket. This appears to be going out of use, but I made a point of using it rather than falling foul of the app again. So after my unintentional stop in Udine, thankfully there was a pretty fast bus to Grado, so dozed half asleep on that, and after a while we were out across the lagoon. Yeah, see, while the Venetian lagoon is a famous area of northern Italy, it's not the only one, and away to the east there is another lagoon which supports several historic towns, including Grado. Before Venice was built out around the Rialto, it was actually a loose collection of settlements in the region, amongst which Grado was an early power base. So while many times less famous than what is now the city of Venice, Grado is something of a mini Venice itself. Again, didn't have very long to keep ahead of the buses. I think I had about 90 minutes. Thankfully, Grado isn't all that huge end to end, and there were some specific things I wanted to hit. The oldest part of Grado is not especially large, but its tight streets are a treat to weave through. Aimed for the Basilica of St. Euphemia, it's incredibly ancient. While, of course, there have been restorations and additions over the years, it's pretty true to its original structure from the 500s. While we haven't shared our trip to Ravenna yet, that was much more recent, you really blink and you could be there. Granted, it doesn't have the show-stopping gold mosaics, but the form of the architecture is only too close. By the water, a basilica that has survived a lot less well. The Basilica della Corte still got some impressive mosaic fragments, and it's nice they've got the archaeology on display. I have to say, the waterfront isn't too much to get excited about, but there's nice views to the curve of the Gulf of Trieste off in the distance. Was very lucky. There was a really decent pizza joint in Grado. I think that went down without even touching the sides of my throat. I had been so focused on getting around and getting footage, I'd barely eaten. I was pretty much just on the espresso and beer all day, so it felt like I'd earned this one. Turned out I'd actually misread the bus timetable, so I had just 30 minutes to kill with time for an espresso and one of those gorgeous, pistachio cream croissants that are quite hard to get outside of Italy. To be honest, it was a funny day. I'd come a long way to hit some pretty specific filming objectives. I was buzzing hitting all these places that, I've wanted to see since forever. But I do realise to an outside audience that doesn't know us, it's perhaps harder to track why I'm doing all of this. And with a not especially user-friendly bus service and slightly less than 4 hours sleep, I have this every so often where, on the one hand, I'm self-actualizing all over the place and the sun is shining and I'm finally getting to see all these places, and so I'm just buzzing. But on that little sleep, and with lots that can potentially go awry and leave you stranded someplace, I'm not going to pretend I also don't get pretty anxious on these days. Don't forget, in a lot of these cases, I usually just have the one day to see them, and there's things like limited rural buses, archaeological sites that close early. It's a lot of emotions at once. Okay, well, back across the lagoon, and this was possibly one of the places I was most excited for. This is Aquilaya. Now, it's possible you've heard of this. I'm never quite sure how deep down the ancient history rabbit hole my audience is, but it's perhaps not the most talked about Roman city ever, but it was amongst some of the largest and most prosperous cities in the empire, the population rising as high as 100,000 at one point. However, its remarkable success was surpassed by its dramatic fall. And while it was a significant harbour, it's also located on the vast flat plain of northern Italy, which represents the major overland route into the Italian peninsula that avoids going through the Alps. This meant that when various groups that have been afforded infamy by the classical writers, the Huns, Goths, and others, were marching on Rome, this is the route they would take, with Aquilaya standing in their path. After a couple of sieges by the Goths in the early 400s, it would be the sack of 452 by the Huns which flattened the greater portion of the city. Some attempts were made to try and rebuild and re-establish the town, but many residents had fled to the lagoons to try and put a stretch of water between them and the invaders. This was at places like Grado and what would later become Venice, a tactic that totally worked, by the way. The once great city of Aquilaya would never fully be able to rise again, and it was further destroyed by the Lombards in 590. Funnily enough, there would be a succession of liturgical slap fights over the centuries between different bishoprics over who would inherit the title of Patriarch of Aquilaya, which at one point had been a highly prestigious title. I've been flashing up some of the main ruin sites in the town during this explainer, though there's a huge amount to cover dotted around in little clusters where the archaeology has been left above ground to visit. The focal point of Aquilae today is the Basilica of Santa Maria Assunta, which, while the structure you can see is from the 1000s, it sits atop many of the remains of previous basilica structures and a frankly bonkers mosaic floor. It is practically the size of a school sports hall and it's all covered in ancient mosaic. Actually slightly kicking myself because the contrasts were really harsh in the light and there were like gantries and people in shot, etc. I didn't get a proper wide shot of the entire thing, which is quite an own goal. I was so focused on getting shots of the individual details. I mean, you could really spend hours photographing this. So yes, looped around further areas, including what was formerly the harbour. Harder to picture as a major waterway now that it's all silted up and there's agriculture filling in the gap between this and the current coastline. As I absolutely baked while waiting for the return bus, you could see this huge storm cloud rising up, which eventually did me the courtesy of providing some shade. And with that, it was train back to Trieste. It was a pretty nuts day. I mean, quick tally, that's 7 separate travel legs to negotiate, and each time, such that if I missed it, it would likely wipe out one or more of the stops that I had planned. After getting back and getting de-grossified, I headed out for a short loop to see Trieste at night. It was a great buzz. The street plan is so vast and the public space is so wide, it never felt particularly busy. Everything is on such a vast scale, monumental neoclassical architecture in all directions. It could not be more different from the tight, shady streets in the towns all the way down the Istrian coast. After that, the evening was a low-key one. I must admit the hosteling experience was a bit of a mix. The people I got to chat to were lovely, and I realised just how lucky I am to be an English speaker, as that tended to be the default language of conversation. And when you actually met people, it was really interesting to swap stories and see what people are up to. But the thing is, I mean, the room, for example, had lights out with people trying to sleep around 10 p.m, and there's 12 of you in the space. So going around a room in the dark, loudly introducing yourself to strangers, yeah, not a great plan. So it sort of came down to who was hanging out at the cafe bar area. So sometimes it was busy, but sometimes it was pretty dead. Anyway, the following morning, I didn't have much time left, but just enough to catch some of the highlights of Trieste itself. Architecture this recent wouldn't usually be of much interest to me, but it really did look amazing in the daytime. Looped around to the Roman Theatre, which is pretty huge and in remarkable shape considering. Then up the hill in search of some views of the town. Got a couple in with trees slightly restricting what I could photograph. Near the top, the Castello di San Giusto is very much in the mould of the sort of Venetian forts we're used to, but just didn't quite have that magic. But round the corner, the real treat, the Basilica of San Giusto, is a Roman basilica originally built sometime between 50 to 100 AD. I'm having to summarise for time, and at this point I didn't have much of it left myself, so a quick step downhill, and other than this Roman arch that survived surprisingly well in amongst all the latter buildings, it was pretty much time to leave. Final word of warning, by the way, this is something else that can make bus travel a little nerve-wracking. Be aware there is a secret, and not at all obvious bit inside the Trieste bus station. It's not a very well-designed building, as it's not at all clear that you have to go through 2 sets of opaque fire exit looking doors to actually get into the terminal where the Flixbus stands are. But then after all that, our actual Flixbus decided to just leave from out front instead. There's a real mounting number of cases where Flixbuses do their utmost to leave from the most obscure or just unexpected places. I'm going to save that story for another time. Anyway, I'll just be completely honest here. Initially, before I got there, I wasn't all that fussed about Trieste. Very much showing my bias here, but as one of the few cities along the eastern side of the Adriatic that Venice didn't control, it just wasn't a major target. I was anticipating sleeping there, and that was about it. But when I realised there was some pretty amazing Roman heritage there, it piqued my interest, and having been, absolutely loved it here. It's a big enough city to have loads going on and an incredible buzz, but not big enough to have the grittier, run-down feel of, for example, parts of Milan. And everyone I talked to was really buzzing about it, like really pleasantly surprised, caught up in the place. Yeah, loving it. So that's our episode on Trieste and Friuli. They're not places you hear talked about all that much, despite some really great highlights, and was pretty chuffed how much we could fit in just a day and a bit. Okay, next time, while I often have some sort of segue or thematic thread that runs between episodes, and we do actually have an episode on Slovenia coming, which is just a short way east from here, we're also going to do some more Italian episodes to go in the playlist, but next time, we've actually got a mini-series from Spain, just because that's what we are doing. If you enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. Please follow us on all the socials. You can also leave a like and a comment to help us out, and we'll catch you all very soon.